Good morning. This will be the final tutorial to help you walk through how to complete your notes for the research process. As you're completing all these note sheets, it would be helpful if you take a copy of them and put all of them into your folder. So I have the one-stop shop where I can go in and give feedback on the spot as you're working on this process. So by now you've created your introduction, you've created your historical evolution, and you've stated what your actual thesis is going to be. Part 3 of your paper will be the most substantial part of the paper that you create, because this is the part where you're going to find 5 to 6 pieces of evidence with analysis to support the thesis that you have come up with. This structure of writing is what we've been working on all trimester. So what you're actually doing is you're creating a thesis and you're defending it. So all of those pieces that we did during the World War II unit, during the Cold War, unit, during the civil rights discussion, all of that will come into play with understanding how to set up your specs and analysis. Obviously, we're not talking about opportunity here, but the idea of how to structure the writing should still be the same. So you're going to look for resources within the last 19 years, 2000 to 2019, that will give contemporary primary and secondary sources that will defend the context of the thesis that you've come up with. What's really important to understand is that evidence can be a study that was done, it can be a graphic, it can be an assumption, but you need to make sure that it's quantifiable or qualifiable data that is a specific fact. It cannot just be a supposition, like an argument by a researcher, so it can't be their opinion, like so and so says this and this makes it true. How did so and so come to that conclusion? What evidence did they have that made them come to that supposition? And that's what you would need to include in this paper. Once you've done that, what I would suggest you do as you work on part 3 is actually set up an outline. Start with your thesis and restate the assertion that you're putting at the end of part 2, and then set up your outline like you've learned how to do in this class. A specs analysis all the way through E specs analysis or F specs analysis, depending on how much evidence you find. And what you're going to do is when you find an article that you believe has strong evidence that will support the claim you're trying to make, that would be your specs. Put the quote directly into this outline, and then what you can do is start building your paper around it. Now, all that's required for the 12th is the specs. So if you set up this outline and all you have done is the specs, you're meeting the requirement of what I expect for you to have done by the 12th. But if you start building your A introduction and your analysis for how it defends the thesis, you're actually going to be working on a substantial amount of your paper ahead of time. And that's what I would recommend. But if you don't do that by the 12th, don't worry. It's not technically due till the 31st. So the only part that's due for the 12th is the specific example, the evidence, with the in-text citation and the full bibliography done in your folder. For this section. The other 2 sections, you need to have the historical evolution done, your introduction done, and also your conclusion part done. But for part 3, when I say the historical notes, what I'm talking about for part 3 is just the specs, just so we're clear about that expectation. So I haven't highlighted in yellow that I would include the outline as part of these notes. Even if you do it later, at least you have the structure set up and ready to go. So if you go to write the paper later, you don't have to do an outline, but in your brain, you can remember the steps of what a good research historical argumentative paper should include. And that's really important as you go to base your research. This is the most crucial part of your paper because this is what makes your research relevant. This is why you're coming to this conclusion, and this is how you're defending it. So of all the parts, 1 and 2 are leading to this point. 3 is kind of the bulk of your paper where you're really supporting that research argument that you've come up with. All right, so that's part 3. Part 4. So briefly, I'm including both of these parts as the end because this is really the conclusion. Your research paper, as you create it, has to have relevance and has to have some form of importance. The conclusion of your paper is just as the conclusion you've done in the past. The first thing that you're going to do is you're going to remind the reader of what you've done in the paper. You're going to restate the thesis. You're going to restate the main points that you made in the paper. You do not need to give any direct quotes again. This is just summing up what the reader has done. And really, the conclusion of your paper should be pretty short. 1 to 2 pages would suffice. It might even be shorter than that, and that's totally fine. fine. So first, remind the reader of the main points that you considered in the paper. Kind of a general overview, just a resummation of the main things that you talked about with your historical evolutions, and just reminding the reader some of your analysis that you did in part 3. Once again, though, you don't need to re-put in direct quotes. You don't need to restate all that evidence. This is more of just like a general sum up. Then the part that you're adding to this paper that may be something new for a lot of you is what we call offering new avenues of research. Whenever you do research, the intention is that you're entering a conversation, you're adding your voice to the process, you're taking evidence and supplying something new for the reader to take in. And then at the end of your paper, you're going to almost tell the future scholars, like, where can you go from my paper? What are some other paths that I didn't explore but could potentially be explored because of the work that I've done? So when you do this section, you're almost answering the questions: what other topics could be explored from your findings, and why is your topic relevant in contemporary America? Almost like contemporary American research is what I should say, or research in general, because some of you are looking at global scales as well. So why is it important to contemporary research? Those two questions should be answered, because the idea is that a scholar or an academic can pick up your paper, read it, and at the end of it be inspired to say, oh, here's a path that I could take. And you'll find that some of the research you're doing as you read academic papers, you're going to see that happen at the end, where they're going to allude to some things that could be potentially explored because of this topic. This is not a substantial part of your paper. It should be at most a paragraph, but the goal is that you're trying to show why your topic is relevant. And then finally, at the end, you should offer a closing thought about the subject as a whole. I caution you to be very careful with this. Almost think of your paper as a circle. Come back to the introduction. What was the case you initially talked about? What was the statistic you put in your introduction? And you almost are going to remind the reader of that by offering a closing thought about, from the research, this is what was gained. Do not open a new argument, though. When we talk about relevance and new avenues, that's the area where you can kind of allude to places you could go. But when you're at the very end of your paper and you're offering that final thought, this is 1 to 2 sentences. It doesn't need to be anything substantial. But the goal is that you should really kind of draw a close to everything that you've said. If you gave a hook in the beginning of a study or a question, this is almost like where you're trying to answer it. I hope this helps. As always, these tutorials are really meant to help break apart the process. So with three tutorials in all 4 parts, you now have the basis for your paper. Your paper is split into 4 sections. Part 1 is your introduction, which is broken apart in the first tutorial. Part 2 is your historical evolution, which was the second tutorial, the 5 points that led you to the thesis you're developing. Part 3 is the defense of your thesis, which is the type of writing we've been doing all trimester in this class. And part 4 is the conclusion, where you conclude all of your main points, offer new avenues of thoughts, and give a closing thought about the topic as a whole. I hope these tutorials are helping. As we move forward, I would consider, if you need that extra support, don't hesitate to reach out. Obviously, the paper's due date is getting ever closer. The notes, though, are these 4 sheets that we've worked through, and they are due by, tentatively, the initial notes are due by the 12th, and then we'll be working on the annotated bibliography the week after the 12th and leading into the development of your rough draft and final draft of your paper. All right, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions.